My father-in-law introduced my wife's ex as the real man of the family right in front of me. I was holding a glass of champagne when Richard Beaumont stood up at the head of the table, tapped his crystal glass with a silver fork, and announced that the man sitting beside my wife was the real man of the family. Not me. Him. The silence that followed felt like falling through ice. My wife, Lauren, stared at her plate. Her ex-boyfriend, Derek, smiled like he'd just won something. And I stood there, champagne in hand, wondering if I'd somehow wandered into someone else's nightmare. The dining room of the Beaumont estate suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the chandelier above casting shadows that seemed to mock me. Richard continued talking, something about traditional values and knowing what a family needs, but his words became background noise. All I could hear was my own heartbeat thundering in my ears and the sound of Derek laughing quietly, smugly, beside my wife of 3 years. I'd been married to Lauren for exactly 3 years and 2 months when this happened. We'd met during graduate school, both pursuing degrees in architecture, and fell into one of those easy relationships where everything just clicked. Her parents seemed thrilled when we got engaged. Richard Beaumont owned a commercial real estate development company worth somewhere north of $80 million, and his wife Patricia came from old Boston money. They threw us an engagement party at their estate in Connecticut that cost more than my childhood home. I should have noticed then how Richard kept mentioning Derek during the toasts, how he'd slip in comments about Lauren's college boyfriend who now ran a successful tech startup. But I was in love, and Lauren would squeeze my hand and roll her eyes, and I'd convince myself it was just awkward small talk from a man who didn't know how to let go of the past. The first real red flag came 6 months after the wedding, when Richard invited Derek to our anniversary dinner. He didn't ask us. He just announced that Derek would be joining us at the Capitol Grill because he happened to be in town, and, as Richard put it, he's practically family anyway. Lauren seemed uncomfortable but didn't object. I tried to be mature about it, shook Derek's hand, made polite conversation about his company's latest funding round. But something about the way Richard lit up when talking to Derek, the way he leaned forward and asked detailed questions about Derek's business strategy, his investments, his 5-year plan, made my stomach turn. When Richard asked me about my work as a project architect at Morrison & Associates, his eyes glazed over after 30 seconds. He checked his phone twice during my answer. Derek noticed. I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. The dinners became a pattern. Every major family gathering suddenly included Derek. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter brunch, Lauren's birthday. He was always there, sitting at Richard's right hand, discussing market trends and investment opportunities, while I tried to participate in conversations that Richard would subtly redirect away from me. Patricia seemed oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind, fussing over place settings and wine pairings. Lauren's younger sister Amanda started giving me sympathetic looks across the table, which somehow made it worse. The night of Lauren's 30th birthday, Richard presented her with a diamond bracelet and announced that Derek had helped him pick it out. He said it with such pride, as if including another man in choosing jewelry for his married daughter was perfectly normal. I felt my face burn, but said nothing. Lauren put the bracelet on immediately and kissed her father's cheek. She didn't look at me for the rest of the dinner. Things escalated when Richard offered me a position at his company. He made the announcement at Sunday brunch in March, 6 months before the champagne moment that would split my life into before and after. He wanted me to come work as a development coordinator, handling permit applications and working with municipal planning departments. It sounded impressive until he mentioned the salary, which was $40,000 less than I was currently making. When I hesitated, explaining that it would be a significant pay cut, Richard's expression cooled. He said something about family being more important than money, about the opportunities for growth, about how Derek had taken a pay cut when he first started his company and look where he is now. The comparison hung in the air like smoke. I declined as politely as I could. Richard's smile never reached his eyes after that. 2 weeks later, Lauren mentioned that her father was disappointed in me, that he'd only been trying to help, that maybe I didn't appreciate what her family was offering. I started noticing other things. Lauren's phone habits changed. She began taking calls in other rooms, closing doors that used to stay open. Her laptop suddenly had a password I didn't know, and when I asked about it casually, she said something about work security protocols, even though she worked as a freelance interior designer from home. She started going to the gym more often, sometimes twice a day, always coming back energized in a way that felt different from regular exercise endorphins. Our intimate life, which had always been good, became mechanical. She was present but distant, going through motions with a distraction behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. When I tried to talk about it, she'd become defensive, accusing me of being paranoid or insecure. She'd remind me how lucky I was to be part of her family, how hard her father worked to include me, despite my obvious lack of ambition. The documentation started by accident. I wasn't trying to spy on my wife. I was trying to understand why my marriage was falling apart. In late August, I borrowed Lauren's iPad to check my email because my phone was dead. A text notification popped up from Derek, just 3 words visible in the preview. Can't wait until. The message disappeared before I could read more, but my hands started shaking. I told myself it could mean anything. Maybe they were planning a surprise party. Maybe it was about a business referral. Maybe I was being paranoid like Lauren said. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside my wife, listening to her breathe, and wondered when I'd become so good at lying to myself. The next morning, I called my college roommate Nathan, who'd become a private investigator after leaving the police force. I didn't tell him everything, just enough. He said he'd look into things discreetly. Nathan's first report arrived via encrypted email 3 weeks later. The subject line read, "You need to see this." The attachment contained 47 photographs taken over a 2-week surveillance period. Lauren and Derek meeting at coffee shops, walking through parks, entering and leaving a downtown condo that Nathan's research showed was registered under an LLC that Derek controlled. The timestamps were damning. Every time Lauren said she was at the gym, at a client meeting, running errands. In one photo, Derek's hand rested on the small of her back exactly the way mine used to. In another, they were kissing in the parking garage of the condo building, her hands in his hair, his pressed against the car behind her. I stared at that photograph for 20 minutes, my vision blurring, trying to find an innocent explanation that didn't exist. Nathan had included a note at the bottom of the report. Financial records show Richard Beaumont wired Derek $200,000 3 months ago. Transaction memo says, real estate investment opportunity. I'm still digging. I didn't confront Lauren immediately. Some instinct told me to wait, to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Nathan continued his investigation, and the picture that emerged was worse than infidelity. It was conspiracy. Richard had been funding Derek for months, not just the $200,000, but smaller payments going back almost a year. Phone records showed regular contact between Richard, Derek, and Lauren, group texts discussing logistics, timing, careful planning. One message thread Nathan managed to recover from cloud backups showed Richard telling Derek to be patient, that they needed to handle this carefully, that I needed to be discredited gradually so the divorce would be clean. Another message from Lauren to her father. He's starting to suspect something. Maybe we should speed things up. Richard's response. Let him suspect. By the time he figures it out, it won't matter. I consulted with 3 different lawyers in early September. The first was Margaret Chen, a family law specialist with 22 years of experience, who came highly recommended. She reviewed Nathan's evidence for 2 hours, her expression growing darker with each document. She explained that what I was facing wasn't just adultery, but potential fraud. If Richard was funding Derek with the expectation that Derek would eventually marry Lauren after a divorce, and if they were coordinating to paint me as an inadequate spouse to justify a favorable settlement for Lauren, it could constitute conspiracy to defraud. The second lawyer, James Kowalski, a litigation specialist, was more aggressive. He wanted to go nuclear immediately, file for divorce with prejudice, seek damages, press criminal charges where possible. The third lawyer, Diana Flores from a white shoe firm downtown, took a more strategic approach. She said the key was documentation and timing. We needed more evidence before making any moves, and we needed to protect my assets and reputation simultaneously. I chose Diana's approach. She had me open a separate bank account and begin documenting every expense, every conversation, every interaction with Lauren and her family. She put me in touch with a forensic accountant named Robert Kim, who began tracing the money flows between Richard's company, Derek's various LLCs, and a web of offshore accounts that suggested this had been planned for much longer than I'd initially thought. Robert discovered that Richard had purchased the downtown condo where Derek and Lauren met 2 years ago, before Lauren and I were even married. The property had been held in a trust that obscured ownership, but Robert found the paper trail. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't an affair that developed over time. This was a plan that had been in motion since before our wedding, maybe longer. The therapist I started seeing in mid-September, Dr. Leonard Reeves, a clinical psychologist specializing in family trauma and betrayal, helped me understand the psychological manipulation I'd been subjected to. He explained narcissistic family systems, how controlling parents like Richard create scenarios where children become extensions of their own ambitions and desires. Lauren had been groomed from childhood to value her father's approval above everything else. Derek wasn't just her ex-boyfriend. He was Richard's chosen successor, the son he never had, the man Richard wanted running his empire eventually. I was an obstacle, a mistake to be corrected. The gaslighting, the social isolation, the subtle digs at my career and masculinity, these weren't random acts of cruelty. They were systematic psychological warfare designed to break me down until I either left voluntarily or became so diminished that Lauren could divorce me with social approval and financial advantage. The champagne moment happened on the 3rd Saturday in October at another mandatory family dinner. Richard had gathered everyone to celebrate some business milestone, another successful development project, another building with his name on it. Derek was there, of course, sitting in what I'd come to think of as his chair at Richard's right hand. Lauren sat beside Derek. I was at the far end of the table near Amanda and her husband. The seating arrangement alone told the story. When Richard stood to make his toast, I knew something was coming. I'd learned to read the particular gleam in his eye when he was about to make a power play. He talked about family, about legacy, about knowing who you could count on when times were tough. He talked about men who understood sacrifice and ambition, men who weren't afraid to take risks and build empires. Then he raised his glass toward Derek and said the words that made my blood freeze. This man right here understands what it means to be part of this family. He's the kind of man who builds things, who creates value, who has the vision and courage this family needs. Derek, you're the real man of this family. The silence that followed felt eternal. Patricia looked confused, her glass half raised, not understanding what had just happened. Amanda's face flushed red with anger. Her husband gripped his fork like a weapon. Lauren's expression was unreadable, carefully neutral, rehearsed. Derek stood, raised his glass to Richard, and thanked him for his confidence and support. He said something about family being chosen, not just given, about earning your place through action, not expectation. He looked directly at me when he said it. Richard beamed like a proud father. I set down my champagne glass very carefully, because my hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. I excused myself from the table, walked through the kitchen, out the back door, and stood in the cold October air trying to remember how to breathe. I could hear voices inside, raised and angry. Amanda was yelling at her father. Lauren was saying something about everyone overreacting. Patricia was asking what on earth was going on. I didn't go back inside. I texted Lauren that I'd taken an Uber home and would talk to her later. She didn't respond for 3 hours. When she finally came home around midnight, she found me in the living room with Nathan's evidence folders spread across the coffee table. Every photograph, every phone record, every financial document. I'd arranged them chronologically, a visual timeline of betrayal. She froze in the doorway, her face cycling through shock, fear, anger, calculation. She tried the denial approach first, claiming the photos were taken out of context, that Derek was helping her with business contacts, that her father's money was a legitimate investment. When I showed her the text messages, her whole story collapsed. She sat down across from me, and for the first time in months, I saw something real in her expression. Not remorse exactly. More like the relief of finally being caught, of not having to pretend anymore. She told me everything. How Richard had never approved of me, had researched my background and found it lacking. How he'd stayed in touch with Derek after their breakup, had seen potential in him, had wanted him back in Lauren's life. How the plan had been to wait a respectable period after our wedding, then engineer situations that would make me look inadequate, unreliable, unsuitable. How Richard had promised Derek a position in his company and eventual partnership in exchange for playing along. How Lauren had resisted at first, but eventually convinced herself that she'd married the wrong man, that Derek was who she was supposed to be with, that her father knew best. She cried when she told me about the affair starting 8 months ago. She said she felt guilty, but also relieved, like she was finally becoming who she was meant to be. She actually said that, like our marriage had been some kind of prison, rather than the partnership I'd believed it was. I asked her one question. Did you ever love me? She took a long time answering. Finally, she said she thought she did, but maybe it was just rebellion against her father's expectations, a way to prove she could make her own choices. Then she realized he'd been right all along. Derek was better suited for her world. I had potential, but no ambition. I was content being a project architect instead of building my own firm. I didn't network aggressively enough, didn't care about the right things, didn't fit into the life she wanted. She said it all very calmly, like she was reading from a script she'd practiced. When she finished, I told her to pack a bag and leave. She argued briefly, said the house was half hers, that we needed to discuss terms. I told her my lawyer would be in touch and that she should probably get her own attorney, one not recommended by her father. She left 20 minutes later, pulling a suitcase I'd given her for our first anniversary. Diana moved fast. She filed divorce papers first thing Monday morning, along with a motion for exclusive use of the marital home based on Lauren's abandonment and infidelity. We included key evidence but held back the majority of Nathan's investigation. Diana wanted to see how Richard and Derek would respond before revealing everything we knew. The response came faster than expected. By Wednesday, I'd been served with a countersuit claiming I'd been emotionally abusive, financially controlling, and had created an unsafe environment that forced Lauren to seek support from family and old friends. Derek was named as a witness to my allegedly threatening behavior. Richard had provided an affidavit stating he'd observed signs of my instability and aggression during family gatherings. It was masterful fiction, carefully constructed lies designed to flip the narrative completely. Diana smiled when she read it. She said they'd just given us everything we needed for a defamation case and possibly criminal charges for perjury and fraud. The second shoe dropped on Friday when I got a call from my firm's HR director. Someone had filed a complaint alleging I'd been falsifying billing records and misrepresenting project hours to clients. The complaint was anonymous, but the timing was suspicious. My supervisor, Kenneth Wright, assured me it was obviously retaliation from my divorce situation, but company policy required an investigation. I was put on paid administrative leave pending review. Diana immediately filed for a restraining order against both Richard and Derek, citing witness intimidation and harassment. The judge, an older woman named Justice Gloria Thompson with 30 years on the bench, reviewed our evidence package and granted a temporary order within hours. Richard was furious. He called me directly, which violated the order the moment it was served. I recorded the call. He told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that he'd bury me financially and professionally, that no one crossed the Beaumont family and survived intact. Nathan's investigation took on new urgency. He discovered that Richard had done this before. Not exactly this scenario, but close enough to establish a pattern. Lauren's older sister had married a man Richard disapproved of 12 years earlier. That marriage lasted 18 months before imploding under mysterious circumstances. The husband lost his job, faced professional accusations that were never proven, and eventually agreed to a divorce with an unfavorable settlement just to escape. He'd left Connecticut entirely, and now lived in Oregon, working under a different name in his field. Nathan tracked him down and got a statement. His story mirrored mine almost exactly. Richard's disapproval, systematic gaslighting, professional sabotage, an ex-boyfriend who suddenly reappeared, coordinated family pressure. The ex-boyfriend in that case hadn't worked out as Richard's chosen replacement, so he'd arranged for Lauren's sister to marry someone from a better-connected family on her second attempt. It was a blueprint, refined over years, that Richard had perfected. The turning point came in early November when Robert Kim's forensic accounting revealed something bigger than an affair conspiracy. Richard's payments to Derek weren't just about getting him together with Lauren. They were laundering money through Derek's tech company to avoid taxes on real estate deals that skirted zoning regulations. Derek's startup was partly a front, legitimate enough to pass casual inspection, but structured specifically to receive Richard's funds, clean them through tech industry investment rounds, and redirect them into offshore accounts. Robert estimated over $14 million had been moved this way over 4 years. It was tax fraud on a massive scale, and Derek was complicit. Robert compiled a detailed report with transaction records, shell company registrations, and communications between Richard and Derek discussing the scheme. We had them on more than personal betrayal. We had them on federal crimes. Diana looped in a federal prosecutor she'd worked with previously, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Brennan, who specialized in white-collar crime. He reviewed Robert's findings with 2 investigators from the Treasury Department, David Nguyen and Rebecca Stone, both with credentials in financial crimes and tax fraud. They opened a formal investigation in mid-November, which meant our divorce case suddenly became entangled with a federal criminal matter. Diana advised me to be patient, that the criminal investigation would ultimately benefit my civil case, but required careful coordination. I was told not to discuss anything with anyone outside my legal team. Lauren tried to contact me several times, leaving voicemails that shifted between apologetic and accusatory. I didn't respond. Richard hired a crisis management firm and a white-shoe criminal defense attorney named Douglas Whitmore, who immediately tried to negotiate some kind of immunity deal for his client. The walls started closing in on Richard in December, when the Treasury investigation expanded to include his business partners and accountants. Several people who'd been tangentially involved in the tax schemes started cooperating in exchange for reduced charges. One of Richard's longtime business associates, Thomas Sterling, provided emails showing Richard had explicitly instructed him to structure deals through Derek's company for tax avoidance purposes. Another associate, Jennifer Wolfe, revealed that Richard had bragged about the scheme at a private dinner party, calling it a brilliant use of the tech industry's valuation ambiguity to move traditional real estate money invisibly. The recording she'd secretly made of that conversation, taken because she was concerned about her own liability, was devastating. Richard's voice describing exactly how he manipulated tax codes and investment structures, laughing about government investigators being too stupid to understand modern business models. Derek tried to flip on Richard before Christmas. He contacted Michael Brennan through his attorney and offered full cooperation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The offer was declined. Derek had been too central to the scheme, had profited too directly, and had helped create the corporate structures that made the fraud possible. His attorney tried to argue Derek was manipulated by Richard, portrayed as a younger man taken advantage of by a powerful, wealthy mentor. But Nathan's investigation had uncovered emails showing Derek had approached Richard first, 3 years ago, pitching himself as someone who could help move money efficiently. Derek wasn't a victim. He was a willing participant who'd seen an opportunity for wealth and social elevation, and had happily helped destroy my marriage as part of the bargain. His prosecution would proceed alongside Richard's. When Derek realized immunity wasn't coming, he tried one last desperate move and called Lauren, telling her she needed to testify that I'd known about Richard's business deals and had been complicit. The call was intercepted by investigators monitoring both their phones. It added obstruction of justice to Derek's growing list of charges. Lauren's position deteriorated rapidly after New Year. She'd initially tried to maintain her innocence, claiming she knew nothing about her father's criminal activities and had simply made a mistake in her personal life. But investigators found text messages on her phone showing she'd been aware of the money movements between Richard and Derek, had even joked about her father's creative accounting, and had actively participated in planning the timing of our divorce to coincide with Derek's final payoff from Richard. She wasn't directly involved in the tax fraud, but she'd known about it and had benefited from it. Diana used this evidence to push for a divorce settlement heavily in my favor. Lauren's attorney, a tired-looking man named Gregory Schultz, who'd been assigned after Richard's arrest, made his previous attorney's conflict out, recommended she accept whatever terms I offered. She signed the papers in late January, agreeing to a division that gave me 70% of our marital assets, full ownership of the house, and a statement accepting fault for the marriage's dissolution due to infidelity and conspiracy with her father to defraud me emotionally and financially. The criminal trial began in early March. Richard and Derek were tried together on charges including tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The prosecution was led by Michael Brennan and featured testimony from 27 witnesses, including 4 of Richard's former business associates, 2 accountants, 3 Treasury investigators, and Nathan, who explained his surveillance operation and evidence collection. I testified for 2 days, describing the psychological manipulation, the systematic exclusion from family decisions, the coordinated effort to undermine my confidence and professional standing. The defense tried to portray me as bitter and vindictive, but Diana had prepared me thoroughly. I stayed calm, stuck to facts, presented documentation for every claim. When Richard's attorney suggested I'd fabricated evidence out of jealousy, Diana introduced the recorded phone call where Richard had threatened to bury me. The jury's expression shifted noticeably during that playback. The moment that seemed to seal Richard's fate came during Patricia's testimony. The prosecution called her as a hostile witness, and she appeared reluctant, confused, clearly unprepared for what was about to happen. Michael Brennan walked her through years of financial records, showing transactions she'd signed off on without understanding what they represented. He showed her the downtown condo Richard had purchased for Derek and Lauren's meetings. He played portions of Richard's dinner party recording where he described his schemes. Patricia's face crumbled as she realized the full extent of her husband's deception, not just of me, but of her, of their family, of everything she thought her life represented. She started crying on the stand, quietly at first, then openly sobbing. She asked to speak directly to the jury and told them she'd believed in her husband completely, had trusted him with everything, and felt like she was learning about a stranger. The jury watched a 70-year-old woman's world collapse in real time. Richard's attorney objected repeatedly, but the damage was done. Derek's defense strategy was to paint himself as ambitious, but ultimately naive, led astray by a powerful older man who dangled wealth and status. His attorney brought in a psychologist, Dr. Aaron Levy, who testified about power dynamics and coercive relationships. But the prosecution destroyed this narrative by presenting Derek's own emails and text messages showing calculation and manipulation. In one message to a friend, Derek had written, "I'm playing the long game here. Richard thinks I'm his puppet, but I'm getting rich and getting the girl." Another message to a business partner. "The old man's tax scheme is risky, but profitable as hell, as long as we don't get greedy." Derek had been a willing, strategic participant who'd weighed risks against rewards and decided federal crimes were acceptable costs for wealth and social climbing. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. The sentencing hearing in early May was standing room only. Reporters filled the back of the courtroom. Richard's social circle attended, some in support, many just curious to watch a titan fall. Lauren sat in the back row, pale and drawn, no longer resembling the confident woman I'd married. Amanda sat beside her, providing support despite everything. Patricia didn't attend. She'd filed for divorce and moved to a sister's home in Vermont immediately after the verdict. Justice Thompson read the sentences with no emotion. Richard received 12 years in federal prison for tax evasion and money laundering, 8 years for fraud and conspiracy, sentences to run consecutively. 20 years total. Derek received 10 years for his role in the tax scheme and an additional 3 for obstruction. 13 years. The courtroom was silent as the numbers fell. Richard's face showed nothing, but I saw his hands grip the table hard enough that his knuckles went white. Derek cried. Both men were remanded into custody immediately. The professional fallout extended beyond the criminal convictions. Richard's company collapsed within weeks of the trial's conclusion. Partners fled, clients canceled contracts, projects stalled. The Beaumont name went from prestigious to toxic overnight. Several business associates faced their own investigations and charges. Richard's commercial properties were seized as proceeds of crime, eventually sold at auction with funds directed to tax restitution. Derek's tech company folded immediately, its investors learning they'd been funding a front operation. Several of them filed civil suits seeking recovery of their investments, though those cases would take years to resolve. Derek's professional reputation was destroyed completely. A simple internet search of his name would forever return headlines about fraud and betrayal. He'd wanted status and success. Instead, he'd earned a permanent place in Connecticut's white-collar crime history. Lauren tried to rebuild her life with limited success. The scandal destroyed her interior design business. Clients who'd hired her because of her family connections now wanted nothing to do with the Beaumont name. She moved to Colorado in July, attempting a fresh start where people might not immediately recognize her. She wrote me one letter before leaving, not asking for forgiveness, but trying to explain. She said she'd grown up believing her father was infallible, that his judgment was superior to everyone else's, that questioning him felt like questioning reality itself. She realized too late that she'd been trained from childhood to value his approval above her own judgment or happiness. She said she hoped I'd find peace and suggested I'd dodged a bullet by discovering the truth when I did, rather than wasting more years in a marriage built on lies and manipulation. The letter was surprisingly self-aware. I read it once and filed it away with the rest of the divorce documents. I didn't respond. My life settled into unexpected calm by late summer. The firm's investigation cleared me completely once the full scope of Richard's sabotage attempts became public. Kenneth Wright apologized personally and offered me a promotion to senior project architect with a substantial raise. I accepted gratefully. The house felt different without Lauren's presence, emptier but also cleaner somehow, like a space that could finally be mine. I painted the walls colors I'd always wanted but she'd vetoed. I bought furniture that suited my taste. I adopted a dog from a shelter, a 3-year-old shepherd mix named Atlas, who'd been abandoned by his previous owners. We went on long walks through the neighborhood, and I slowly remembered what it felt like to be content with ordinary moments rather than constantly performing for an audience that would never approve anyway. Amanda stayed in touch, calling every few weeks to check in and apologize on behalf of her family. She'd cut off contact with her father and sister, unable to forgive what they'd done. Her husband had supported her through the decision, despite the social awkwardness it created. She told me that watching everything unfold had forced her to re-examine her entire childhood, recognizing patterns of manipulation and control she'd normalized as family dynamics. She'd started therapy with Dr. Reeves, working through decades of conditional love and impossible expectations. We met for coffee occasionally, not quite friends, but bonded by shared trauma and the strange intimacy of having witnessed each other's lives implode. She asked once if I hated them all. I told her honestly that I didn't, that hate required more energy than they deserved, that mostly I felt grateful for the clarity. The civil lawsuit I filed against Richard and Derek for fraud and emotional distress settled out of court in September. Both men's assets had been largely seized or frozen, but insurance policies and remaining accounts provided some recovery. My attorney Diana negotiated a settlement of $1.3 million, split between Richard's remaining personal accounts and Derek's seized assets. The money meant less than the principal. They'd tried to destroy me financially, professionally, emotionally. Instead, they'd destroyed themselves while I walked away whole. The settlement funds went mostly into investments and retirement accounts, a foundation for a future they'd tried to prevent me from having. I kept $50,000 aside for immediate use and spent $10,000 on a month-long trip to Japan, something I'd always wanted to do, but Lauren had dismissed as impractical. Nathan and I stayed close friends. He said my case had been the most personally satisfying investigation of his career, not for the money, but for the justice of watching arrogant people underestimate someone and then face consequences they'd thought themselves immune to. He'd started using aspects of the case, with names changed, in training seminars for other investigators, teaching them how to document emotional manipulation and coordinate with multiple legal authorities. He told me the key lesson was patience, that rushing to confront betrayal often lets perpetrators escape or minimize consequences, but careful evidence collection builds cases that become undeniable. I thanked him for his work with a bonus payment beyond his contracted fees. He tried to refuse, but I insisted. He'd given me back my life. That was worth more than any invoice could capture. The anniversary of the champagne moment passed quietly this October. I was sitting on my back deck, Atlas asleep at my feet, drinking coffee and watching autumn leaves spiral across the yard. I thought about that night exactly 1 year ago, standing frozen while Richard announced Derek as the real man of the family. I thought about the humiliation, the confusion, the sick feeling of my world tilting beneath me. Then I thought about everything that followed, the investigation, the exposure, the trials, the convictions. The real man of the family was serving year 1 of 20 in federal prison. His chosen successor was 3 months into 13 years. And I was here, free, whole, drinking coffee in the morning sunshine with a dog who loved me unconditionally. The universe had a sense of humor after all. Dr. Reeves and I had terminated therapy in August by mutual agreement. He said I'd processed the trauma remarkably well, that some people never recover from betrayal that deep and systemic. I told him I'd had advantages, resources, and support many people don't have when their lives explode. He said that was fair, but didn't diminish the work I'd done to rebuild, that having resources was meaningless without the will to use them constructively. Our final session focused on lessons learned and patterns to watch for in future relationships. He cautioned me against cynicism, said the worst outcome would be letting Richard and Lauren's sickness poison my ability to trust again. I promised I'd try to stay open while being smarter about red flags. He smiled and said that was all anyone could do, learn from pain without letting it define them, stay vulnerable enough to connect, but wise enough to protect themselves. I started dating again in September, casual at first, coffee meetings and museum visits that might lead somewhere or might not. I told potential partners early about my divorce, framing it honestly, but without excessive detail. Some women were scared off by the story's intensity. Others appreciated the transparency. I met Catherine in late October at a gallery opening Amanda had dragged me to. She was a landscape architect visiting from Seattle, in town for a conference. We talked for 3 hours about design philosophy and career paths and the challenges of creative work in corporate structures. She'd been divorced too, 6 years ago, under less dramatic circumstances, but still painful. We understood each other's caution and appreciation for emotional honesty. She flew back to Seattle the next week, but we stayed in touch. I planned to visit her in December. It felt promising but low pressure, exactly right for where I was in rebuilding. The house sold in November. I'd debated keeping it, but ultimately decided too many memories haunted the rooms. I bought a smaller place closer to downtown, a converted warehouse with exposed brick and massive windows that flooded the space with light. The architecture appealed to my professional sensibilities, and the location put me within walking distance of restaurants, bookstores, the life I wanted, rather than the one I'd been performing. Atlas loved the new space, particularly the rooftop deck where he could survey the neighborhood like a benevolent king. I furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing pieces that reflected who I actually was rather than who I thought I should be. The aesthetic was more industrial than Lauren's taste would have allowed, more masculine, more mine. Every choice felt like reclaiming myself. Christmas approached with none of the dread I'd felt during previous holiday seasons. No mandatory dinners at the Beaumont estate, no awkward conversations with Derek, no trying to pretend everything was fine while dying inside. Amanda invited me to her family's celebration, but I declined gently, needing this first holiday alone to prove I could be content with my own company. I cooked an elaborate meal for myself, risotto and roasted vegetables and an expensive bottle of wine Nathan had sent as a gift. I video called my parents, who'd been supportive throughout everything, and my younger brother in California, who'd flown out twice during the worst of it just to sit with me. We talked for an hour about everything and nothing. When I hung up, I felt grateful in a way I hadn't in years, for simple connections with people who loved me without agenda or manipulation. The final chapter came in January, when I received notification that Richard had filed an appeal of his conviction. His new attorney was arguing procedural errors and improper admission of evidence. Diana called to tell me not to worry, that appeals were common, and this one had minimal chance of success given the overwhelming evidence and clean trial record. She said Richard was probably just exercising his legal options because he had nothing else to do with his time. The appeal would take 18 months to process, and she'd keep me informed of developments. I thanked her and went about my day. Richard's desperate attempts to rewrite history no longer had power over me. He was a small man who'd briefly seemed large because I'd been looking at him from the wrong angle. Now I saw him clearly, diminished and irrelevant, a cautionary tale rather than a threat. I ran into Patricia in February at a coffee shop in downtown Hartford. She was with an older woman who looked like her sister, the one from Vermont. She saw me and froze, coffee cup halfway to her lips. I nodded politely, ready to give her space if she wanted it. Instead, she approached my table and asked if she could speak with me for a moment. Her sister took their drinks to a corner booth to give us privacy. Patricia sat down across from me, looking older than I remembered, her face lined with stress and grief. She apologized, not for Richard's actions, which she said were beyond her understanding or excuse, but for her own blindness. She said she'd spent 43 years building a life with a man she realized she'd never actually known. She asked how I was doing, and I told her honestly, better than expected, building something new. She smiled sadly and said she was glad at least one person had escaped her family's destruction with a future intact. Spring arrived with the kind of weather that makes you remember why people live in New England despite the brutal winters. Atlas and I took longer walks, exploring trails along the Connecticut River, watching geese return and trees bud. I'd been promoted again at the firm, this time to associate partner with a focus on sustainable development projects. The work was challenging and meaningful, exactly what I'd wanted when I entered the field. Catherine and I had grown closer over months of phone calls and visits. She was considering a transfer to her company's Boston office, which would put her 90 minutes away instead of across the country. We were taking it slow, both wary of rushing into anything serious, but the potential felt real. She'd met Atlas and loved him. He'd approved of her, which I'd decided to take as a good sign. The last time I thought about that champagne moment, really thought about it, was on a hiking trip in late April. I'd reached the summit of Bear Mountain, Atlas beside me, the valley spread out below in every direction. The view was spectacular, but what struck me was the perspective. From up here, everything looked different, problems and triumphs reduced to their true proportions. Richard's cruelty, which had felt suffocating and inescapable when I was trapped in it, now seemed pathetically small. An insecure man trying to control the world around him because he couldn't control his own fear of insignificance. Derek's betrayal was equally diminished, an ambitious climber who'd gambled on a shortcut and lost everything. Lauren's complicity, sad more than infuriating, a woman who'd never learned to trust her own judgment over her father's toxic approval. And me, I'd been the collateral damage in their story until I decided to become the author of my own. That was the real transformation, not the legal victories or financial settlements or professional success, but the moment I stopped reacting to their narrative and started writing my own. The moment I'd laid out those evidence folders on my coffee table and decided I deserved the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The moment I'd chosen clarity over comfortable delusion. That night, sitting across from Lauren as she confessed to everything, I'd been terrified of what came next. Now I understood that fear had been the beginning of freedom, the first step into a life where I'd never again accept less than I deserved. I stood on that mountain for 20 minutes, letting the wind clear my head and the sun warm my face. Atlas sat patiently beside me, occasionally looking up to make sure I was okay. I thought about all the people who'd helped me through the darkness, Nathan and Diana and Dr. Reeves, Amanda and Kenneth, my family, and real friends. I thought about Catherine waiting in Seattle, cautiously hopeful about our future. I thought about the house I'd made mine, the work I loved, the simple pleasure of morning coffee on the deck with a good dog, and no one's expectations to meet but my own. Richard had stood at the head of that table and declared Derek the real man of the family. He'd been wrong. The real man was whoever could look at betrayal without flinching, could walk through fire and emerge still capable of kindness, could lose everything he thought defined him and discover he'd been stronger than any of them realized all along. I called Atlas and started the hike down, ready for whatever came next. Behind me, the view stretched for miles. Ahead, the trail wound down through trees still bare from winter, but beginning to bud with the promise of spring. It seemed like a good metaphor. I smiled at my own dramatic thoughts, but let myself enjoy them anyway. I'd earned the right to a little optimism, a little hope, a little belief that the future could be better than anything the past had tried to steal. The real man of the family wasn't defined by Richard Beaumont's approval, or Derek's ambition, or Lauren's choice. The real man was whoever refused to let other people's sickness become his own, whoever walked away from poison even when it was dressed up as belonging. That was strength. Everything else was just noise, and I was done listening to anything that didn't sound like peace. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.